Who's up for some more Crazy House? We have a special episode today. I'm not going to be going over one of my games as much as I enjoy that. Today we're going to look at a game played between two American grandmasters on a YouTube live stream. So the game was played. So Hikaru Nakamura was white and Wesley So was black. This game was played around, I think, January 2019. A link to the game will be in the description below. And I think it was played at around a 3 minute time control on each side. So it's an amazing game. They played a number of games against each other, and this one particularly stood out to me just because there's some amazing tactics in there, and almost as incredible as what happened is what didn't happen. So I'll be looking at some of that analysis, during the session. So with that being said, let's get started. So the opening was kind of, kind of tame. In some of the games that I've showed you guys, they've been, opening with pawn e4, and those Crazy House games tend to be a lot more explosive and much more tactics and immediate attacks. This game, like d4 can be in Crazy House, is a little bit tamer. Here we just have like a simple London system, and really both sides just kind of develop very solid, kind of delaying any skirmishes until later on. And so I'm not going to spend a lot of time on what happens here. Just know that there's just a lot of jockeying for position, around the e4 square, e4, f5, g4, f3. There's just a lot of play around here. I'm just trying to see who can get some sort of advantage. But there's just a lot of exchanges happening. Okay, black plays pawn h6. Maybe there's an idea to play bishop takes h6 and drop a pawn on g5. But that's not what Hikaru played. So we'll just keep up with the game. All right. So I mean, black has a really comfortable position. He's got strong, good development. But at the same time, white's pretty solid too. All right. Okay, so here's where the game kind of starts to get interesting. So here we have a knight fork on the queen and the rook. And I think in Hikaru's commentary, he actually mentions how he wasn't really concerned about this because, yeah, so a rook is better than a knight. But in Crazy House, it's really not that much of a difference. And actually, rooks are kind of clumsy in Crazy House, whereas knights can be very, very devastating. All right, so white just going to calmly plays queen e2. Black takes the rook. And instead of recapturing the knight directly, Hikaru plays an intermezzo, captures the bishop on e5. So, black pretty much has to retake that knight. You can't have a knight on f5 in Crazy House. It's just leading to all kinds of horrible things. And here, Hikaru makes an interesting move. He plays bishop e7, again, instead of recapturing the knight. All right, so here's where the game really starts to get interesting. So Wesley So played a rook e8, but he had the possibility of taking the bishop here and giving up the queen. So as I think we've mentioned before, in Crazy House, material is not that important. What's really important is initiative, is attacking, and above all, king safety. And what you can see here is that white's king there's not a lot of protection around white's king. And so by doing this, black really takes the initiative. And now he can drop a bishop on e4. And this bishop is really strong, just cutting through white's position. A really strong bishop. I mean, white should probably recapture the bishop and play the game and play on from there. But let's see what happens if white gets greedy. So again, black's king is very well protected. White's king is relatively undefended. So if white were to play something like bishop takes f6, that knight is a key defender, and now you have this bishop also into the attack. This could be a very strong attack for white if he survives the next few moves. And that's the question, because now black has a free move. He's got this beautiful bishop, and knight h3 is a very strong move. So clearly, white can't recapture the knight because of this bishop, and black can just drop a rook on h1, and that'll be mate. So you can't recapture the knight. If you play king h1, then black can drop a rook on g1, and then that will be mate. So really, the only option is to capture the knight. And so here, black can just start checking, trade off the bishops. So you remove a defender and you create weaknesses in white's position. And now you can drop a rook on h1. The king has to go to e2. And now here you have this nice knight check on f4. kind of winning a pawn and kind of getting the knight back into the game and to protect the king side possibly. King goes to d2, and now this is probably possible to recapture the rook, but even better is to just recapture this bishop. That bishop was going to be a problem if it was left there, and now you recapture the bishop, you bring the knight back into the defense of the king, and yeah, white can then win this rook, but really it's not a problem because black's king is safe. White has no material on the board. He's got a lot of material to drop, but you could only drop one piece at a time, and I think that's an important principle in Crazyhouse. And so black can just play something like rook e8. So all his pieces are in the game. There's really soft squares on e2. The queen has to move, and this is just a really good Crazyhouse position for black. He's got some material to drop. White is absolutely on the defensive here. And of course, if this queen were to move, well, then rook e2 is a serious threat. All right, so that's what could happen on bishop takes f6. Now, what if instead of playing bishop takes f6, white tried playing rook takes f1? Again, same idea, knight h3. So now the king can't run to f1 again, and of course, capturing the knight on h3 leads to a mate with a rook on h1. So really, the only choice is to play king h1. Now, usually in these positions, black has a smothered mate, right? With rook g1, rook takes g1, knight f2. But this bishop is protecting the f2 square, so unfortunately, that's not a possibility here. But that's okay, because again, this goes back to white's king being relatively unguarded. So black can just play bishop takes g2, the king has to capture, and then again, you have this beautiful knight check on f4. And this knight is so strong. It's controlling these critical g2, h3 squares. White is so weak on these light squares, and that will ultimately be his undoing. And this is a very common idea in Crazyhouse, okay? So it comes in all variations, but this theme, this idea of having like knights on f4 and h3 to mate the king is very common. So it's very common. And I think this is an illustrative example as well. Okay, so I mean, white has a number of moves here, but none of them are good. I mean, if he tries to play the king to f3, black can just drop a pawn on e4. Very nice position. He can't even take the knight because of rook f3 mate. So there's all kinds of possibilities here. If he were to play the king back to g1, well then black can just drop a pawn on g2 with a threat of mate on h1. And this, how do you defend this? Really, how do you defend this? It's not easy. White can try dropping a knight on g3 to defend the h1 square, but it doesn't really make a difference. Black drops, capture. You can make a queen or a rook, doesn't really matter. King takes, and now you have everything that you need. You get to drop a pawn on g2 with check, so that was the whole point. The king goes to g1. Unfortunately, you don't have a rook to drop on h1, but you do have a knight to drop on h3, and so this is checkmate. So again, a very common idea, knights on f4, h3, a pawn on g2, and a white king that has absolutely nowhere to go. All right, so those are some of the possibilities that happen after the queen sack. Okay, so that's not what happened in the game, though. Let's go back to the game. All right, so in the game, black played rook e8. All right, so pinning the bishop against the queen. All right, so in the game, Nakamura took this knight, and then after the bishop-knight exchange, only then did he take the queen. So that was probably not advisable, because if you think about it, this bishop is a very strong defensive piece, protecting the pawn on f2, taking this h4 square away, whereas this knight's not really doing anything. So it would have been advisable to immediately take the queen and not trade this bishop for this knight, okay? Because already the white king is lacking defenders, and this bishop was actually a pretty good defender. So just something to note. All right, but in the game, first white captured the knight, now knight captures bishop, and now we have this queen exchange, and both sides just have a ton of material. In fact, the material is almost exactly equal. If white captures this rook, then the material will be exactly equal. All right, so I think Nakamura either on this move, but definitely on the next move, mentions that someone's going to get mated. It's just a question of who's gonna be able to mate who. And I guess Nakamura didn't feel like he could go for it. So before he undertook any attack against the king, first he captured this rook. So now we're at probably the most important position in the game. So what does black do? Black has a free move, which is precious in Crazyhouse, and he really has to make it count. And so I thought he played a brilliant move, and I really like this move, and it's one of the reasons why I wanted to show this game. He drops a knight on g3, and this is just amazing. There's a threat of mate on h, so he's black's threatening to mate on h1, and I don't see any way that you can stop that mate while without capturing this knight. But by capturing the knight, you're either going to create a hole on h2 or f2. And so let's see what happens. If white captures with the h pawn, now you have a hole on h2, and it's going to be mate. All right, so that doesn't work. Now, alternatively, you can capture with the f pawn. Now you have a hole on f2. Bishop comes to f2. If you don't capture the bishop, it's going to be mate on g1. So capture the bishop. It doesn't matter though. Knight just comes to e4. And then we have king e1, queen f2, king d1, and this is a forced mate as well. So it's just an amazing move, and it's very pretty, dropping a knight on a square where it can be captured twice, and yet nothing works. And I think this is, I think I've seen this tactical idea before in Crazyhouse, so it's something to remember. It doesn't have to be a knight. You could drop a pawn on here even. It all depends on the situation, but it's a very cool idea. The one flaw with this move is that it's not check, and white can't defend, but he has a move to attack. And so that's what Nakamura does. And in the notes of the game, he pretty much says, all right, well, I just have to mate him now. And so he gives it a shot. And so what does he do? First, he drops a rook on f8, deflecting the black king from the h8 square. So black's forced to capture the rook. This will just be mate, so forget about this idea. That's not happening. All right, this bishop is covering the h5 square. Okay, so black is forced to capture the rook. Now that allows white to drop a queen on h8. And okay, so I wasn't sure what black would play here, but he did drop a rook on g8, which makes sense because attacking the queen. At the same time, it does give the queen the possibility of capturing the rook at some point. Whoops, excuse me. Okay, so anyways, so black dropped a rook on g8. So white only has two pieces left, and so what's he gonna do? So he drops a bishop on e7. It's pretty much forced. King has to go to e8, and now he plays a nice move. Plays bishop b5. So he takes a bishop that wasn't really doing anything on e2, and he brings it back and he brings it into the attack. So a nice move by Hikaru. All right, so black blocks the bishop with pawn c6, and now white captures the pawn. So again, adding another attacker to the adding another piece to drop into the attack. All right, so black has to take, and now of course this queen is doing nothing, right? So you might as well give it up for the rook. Knight takes g8, and now you can drop a rook on f8. So again, the king has nowhere to go. King has to go to d7. But it's starting to look pretty bad for black, and white has this amazing knight to drop on c5. And this is incredible because, white has complete control of these dark squares. And now with the knight on c5, he has control of these light squares. So dark squares and light squares, there's no other colors left. So black is in a lot of trouble here. And sure enough, it's actually going to be mate, king c8. And there's many number of ways to mate here. And Hikaru plays a bishop a5, and that's it. All these squares are taken. All these squares are being attacked. So I think in this position, black resigned. So it's just an incredible a desperate final attack that completely worked. But during the game, I was wondering one thing, or not while I was watching this, I was wondering, in this position, what if black didn't drop a rook on g8? Because you could see how important that rook was. White dropped that rook on f8 and really, pushed the king into the attack. I thought black should drop a bishop on g8 because bishop's not going to hurt you maybe as much as a rook in this position. So what would happen if if black dropped a bishop on g8 instead of a rook. All right, so I mean, play would proceed somewhat similarly. Bishop e7, king e8, bishop b5, c6. And okay, well, you don't necessarily have to capture this right now. But at some point, the queen has to give itself up. I mean, it has to. It's doing nothing on h8. So here we go. Queen takes g8, knight takes g8. So we have a very similar position. The bishop is still on the board, but with a bishop to drop instead of a rook. And turns out that it works out. Here, instead of playing rook f8, you drop a knight on d6. And so king has to go to d7. And now you get to drop a bishop on e8. And it's just, it works. Like, where does the king go? The king has nowhere to go. He has to go to e6. White has no material to drop, but that's okay. Bishop takes f7. The king has to go to d7, and it's mate. So, during the game, I wasn't sure if dropping a bishop on g8 would have won, but clearly, now that I've done the analysis, it's also winning. So there's no question in my mind that that in this position, after rook f8, white is completely winning. So an amazing idea by Wesley So, but an even more incredible desperation attack by Hikaru. And I think after he won the game, he himself was kind of surprised. He wasn't sure if this was going to work, but sure enough, it does work. Yeah. So the question that I have then is, well, did black have anything better? Instead of dropping a knight on g3 clearly doesn't work. Could he have played something better, either a defensive move or an attacking move that would have worked out? And so immediately, you think of the move like knight h3, right? Dropping a knight on h3. It's with check, and now the king can't capture either way because a rook on g1 or a queen on g1 will mate. So let's see. Pawn. So you have to take the knight. So now what do? You have a bishop, you have a rook, you have a queen. You don't have enough material to really start going crazy around here. But what you do, and this is an incredible move, you could drop a rook on g3. So it's a very similar position to before. So instead of dropping a knight on g3 without check, you drop a rook on g3 with check, and it's the same idea. Depending on which way you capture, you're going to create a weakness, and black is going to be able to exploit that weakness. So, I mean, there's three possibilities here. H takes, F takes, and dropping something on G2. So let's take a look at all of them. So first, let's take a look at H takes G3. All right, so now you've opened this H2 square, so, black can drop a bishop on here. And, white has to play king G2. You drop a queen on g1, king f3, and now, I mean, black can take this bishop very calmly, and white, he doesn't have a mate right now. He has a lot of material, but he doesn't have a mate, and meanwhile, white's king is really exposed. Same time, black doesn't have a lot of material either. So the best move here is to actually just capture this knight. Add more material and just try and starve black of pieces. So what does black play? Black can drop a bishop on h5. Okay, so kind of attacking the king, and then we have king e3, and queen takes f1, just giving up more material. But white's king is so exposed, and again, white is one or two moves away from actually initiating an attack on black's king. Black's king is very safe right now. So there's white has nothing to gain by attacking, and he's under serious pressure. So what does he do? He recaptures the queen, and now black can drop a rook on f3. And if white plays king d2, we have knight e4 check, and this is looking like a pretty dangerous attack. The king can go to any of these three squares. We won't look at all of them, but let's look at what happens on king e1. On king e1, black has no material to drop. He'd love to drop a pawn on d2. So, you can play bishop takes g3. And this is just really dangerous. The bishop's threatening to come on f2. You have a pawn drop on d2. And then with the pawn drop on d2, king goes to d1. Now you have a discovered attack. Like, this is really dangerous. So I mean that's what happens on something like h takes g3. All right, what about f takes g3? Okay, what about f takes g3? So now you've created, you've opened up this diagonal. So what can black do? Black can drop a bishop on e3, and if the king moves, you have a mate on g1. So white can interpolate with a bishop on f2. Bishop takes, king takes, and here again you have this knight e4 move, again attacking these critical squares. If you move back to this side, then you bring a queen on f2 and it's going to be mate. So you could try king e1, but this doesn't work either. You have a queen drop on e1, and this is checkmate. So very very dangerous. And let's look at one more line. So there's also a bishop, drop a bishop on g2. So what happens in this position? Well, clearly you're just going to, take the bishop, obviously, add another piece, and kind of deflect the king to a very vulnerable square. And here you have, this very nice square for the bishop, right? It's always a nice square for the bishop. White pretty much has to block with something. And so if you block the knight on f3, then black just calmly captures this bishop. And again, his king is very safe. Meanwhile, white is he's in a pin. He's got weaknesses, and it's tough position. So again, white has a free move. It's a good idea would be to take this knight off the board, and add another attacker to your position. But black just has the initiative. He has the initiative. He's creating all kinds of threats against this knight on f3. White can try to overprotect it by playing a knight to h4, but really it's just the attack just continues. And here's what's really nice: you can drop a bishop on e2, so now you can't defend them both. So it's a very nice threat here. If you try to again drop a knight on e1 to try and protect your position a bit, again black just drops a bishop on e4, and then you just have these light squares are just so soft, and there's all kinds of threats here. And if these knights come off, then and now with a bishop on e4, you have these ideas of dropping a knight on h4, and it's just very, very dangerous. And so really that would have been, I don't know if it was winning, but it would have been a very, very strong attack. Dropping a knight on h3, pawn takes the knight, and then dropping a rook on g3. And there's all kinds of possibilities. Probably the most critical one, probably the best line for white, is this h takes g3 line, with the queen sack and then the king here. But ultimately, it's all good for black. Yeah, it looks like actually there was a line here I wanted to show you guys. Okay, so bishop h2, king h1. All right, here bishop h5. And then we take the bishop first. Rook takes f1. Now you have this bishop to drop on h5. King e3, capture. Okay, we saw this line before. Rook f3, king d2, knight e4. And so we looked at this king e1 idea, right? We looked at king e1, bishop takes g3 with a very strong attack. Let's also look at one last line. Let's look at king c1. So on king c1, what happens here? Black has no material to drop, but his king is safe. So it gives him the opportunity to play this, nice calm rook move. It's very good. You win a pawn, you're attacking this bishop. This bishop's line is clear, and you have a very devastating pawn drop on d2 if white lets you. So this is a critical position, and actually I don't know if really white can defend this. So what he has to do is he has to go on the attack with knight e7. Now's the time. He has all this material. He has to try and use it somehow. Okay, so what happens on king h8? Okay. So on king h8, white can play a crazy move like queen d1. This is insane, right? But at the same time, at least you're protecting, the pawn on d2 and the bishop on f1. So what happens here if black just takes the bishop, takes the queen and now as soon as as soon as black has an opportunity to move, that queen is going to get dropped and white's going to die. But with the king on h8, this is actually a winning position for white, because now that that bishop is gone, protecting these squares, now you can drop a knight on g6, which you couldn't before because you had that bishop protecting the square. And now it's white's turn to attack. So f takes g6, knight takes g6, king h7. White has all this material to drop, and he's going to make good use of it, and it's just going to end up into a winning. He has 3 rooks. Look at that, 3 rooks. You drop a rook on h8, and if you play king f7, you can drop a queen on e6, and if you take it, well, then this is just going to be mate. So just deflect the bishop from h5 and just start giving up all your material to make the king. Right. So that's what happens on king h8. Really, if black were to play king h7 in this position, and white were to try to do the exact same thing with queen d1, well, it doesn't work now because the king is on h7, bishop takes d1, and now you don't have that knight to drop on g6. You could play knight g5 check, and you could get into something like this, and you could play bishop g6 check to remove this pawn from the situation. You could play knight f6, so you're just giving up everything to open the king up. But what you're left with is 2 rooks and a queen, and it's just not enough. You just don't have enough here. What you really need, you need to drop a knight on h5, which you can't even because it's guarded by the bishop. Like, you need something, and you just don't have it with a pawn, a rook, and a queen. There's just really nothing here. Now black's the one with all the material. His king is safe. This is completely winning for black. Alternatively, instead of playing in this position, so knight check king h7, instead of dropping a queen on d1, what if you drop the knight on e3, defending f1, possibly defending d1. In this situation, well, the key point is that you haven't defended d2, so black can drop a pawn on d2, and now white's forced to play to b1. Black has no material, but that's okay because he can capture the bishop on f1, and now when the knight takes the rook, he is no longer guarding the d1 square. So you deflect the knight from d1, and now you can play, you can make a queen, and if white drops a bishop on c1, well, you can play queen takes f1, and now white does not have enough material to attack the king. Meanwhile, black has a queen now, and white's king is not very safe, and this is just a winning position for black. So an incredible game, just a beautiful idea by Wesley So to play knight takes to drop a knight on g3, and it created some amazing threats, but ultimately it didn't work because it gave Nakamura the move, and he was able to turn that into a checkmate. But ultimately, Wesley So could have won the game by dropping a knight on h3 and then dropping a rook on g3, and it would have just made an amazing attack. So a beautiful game, and I'll keep my eye out for beautiful ones and analyze them. Or if you have any suggestions, please let me know. Okay, thanks so much for watching, and I'll see you guys soon. Okay, take care.